Marcus Reyes had spent 6 months getting ready for the interview that could rescue his career. But on his way to Meridian Logistics Group, he pulled over to help a stranded woman in a downpour, showed up late, and was treated like a man who couldn't manage his own priorities. Inside the interview room, Delphine Cross looked at him with open disdain and called him a single father who clearly hadn't learned to put his priorities in order. Marcus was certain the opportunity was already lost. Then the door opened. The woman he had helped on the roadside walked in, took off her coat, sat down at the head of the table, and said one line that changed everything, "Go on. I want to hear how he answers." At 6:20 that morning, Marcus was already awake, running through his notes for the third time. He'd been out of work for nearly 4 months, ever since the logistics firm where he'd spent 9 years restructured its operations division and cut his role along with dozens of others. The interview at Meridian wasn't just another opportunity, as far as he could tell. It was the only real shot he'd had in months to get his career back on the path he'd spent his adult life building. He'd studied the company for weeks, poring over quarterly reports, distribution summaries, and public statements from its leadership until he understood the business better than a lot of the people who worked there. He'd even sketched out a rough proposal addressing an operational weakness he suspected the company was quietly dealing with, though he had no way to confirm it until he was actually in the room. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to his last 3 interviews, pressed and brushed the night before, since it was the only one that still fit the way he wanted. Before leaving the apartment, he checked the pickup schedule for his son that evening, sent a quick message to the sitter, then put his phone away and didn't touch it again until the interview was over. He gave himself 45 extra minutes of travel time, more than he thought he'd ever need, because he'd promised himself there would be no excuses today, no matter what. The apartment held the particular stillness it only had before sunrise, before his son woke up asking for cereal or a missing shoe or help finding a permission slip that had been sitting on the counter for a week. Marcus had built his whole routine around protecting mornings like this one, and 4 months of job searching had taught him exactly how fragile that protection could be. One delayed bus, one missed alarm, one unexpected call from the school, and a whole day's plan could fall apart before it even began. He'd lived through enough of those mornings to know the difference between an excuse and a real emergency, and he'd promised himself long ago he would never let the two blur in front of an employer. It was a quiet kind of discipline no resume line could capture, the discipline of building redundancy into a life with very little margin for error. He thought briefly about the version of himself who'd walked into interviews 5 years earlier, before the layoffs, before the long stretch of rejections and unanswered applications, before he knew what it felt like to explain an employment gap to a stranger holding a folder. That version of him had never worried about arriving early enough to prove he belonged in a room. He'd simply belonged. Now every interview carried a low hum of something to prove, and Marcus had grown almost used to walking in already several steps behind, already braced for a question about the gap, already rehearsing an answer that sounded confident without sounding defensive. It wore on him in a way that rarely showed on his face. He'd gotten very good at not letting it show. Marcus believed he'd closed off every possible reason to be late. He'd mapped the route the night before, planned around traffic near the financial district, and left with enough cushion to absorb almost anything a normal morning could throw at him. But about 20 minutes before his scheduled time, driving down a service road slick with rain, he spotted a gray sedan pulled tight to the curb, hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. A woman crouched near the front wheel, wrestling with a jack while cars sped past close enough to spray water across her coat. Marcus slowed without deciding to. He glanced at the dashboard clock, ran the math in his head, and understood exactly what stopping would cost him. He sat with his hands on the wheel a moment, watching her in the rearview mirror, running the same calculation every driver in his position runs and wishes they didn't have to. He was already tight on time. Stopping meant risking everything he'd spent 6 months building toward every rehearsed answer, every pressed shirt, every hour of preparation poured into one narrow window of opportunity. But he also knew what it felt like to stand on the shoulder of a busy road while people drove past pretending not to notice, because he'd been on the other side of that exact moment before. Back when his own car had broken down outside a grocery store with his son buckled into the back seat, and no one stopped for nearly 20 minutes. He remembered exactly how that felt. He pulled over anyway. The woman was Renata Voss, though Marcus had no idea who she was and no reason to ask. Her tire had blown after running over metal debris in the gutter, and the spare in her trunk was underinflated enough to make the jack unstable on the wet pavement. Her phone was down to a sliver of battery, and the roadside service she'd called had quoted a wait long enough to derail her whole morning. Marcus offered to help before she even asked. He knelt beside the wheel in his pressed suit, ignoring the rain soaking through the fabric, and started working the lug nuts loose with the small kit he kept in his own trunk for exactly this kind of situation. Up close, Renata looked less like someone caught in an ordinary morning and more like someone rarely inconvenienced, though nothing in her manner suggested she expected special treatment. She thanked him twice before he'd even opened his trunk, apologizing for the intrusion as if asking a stranger for help were somehow putting him out rather than a simple decency. Marcus waved off the apology and crouched by the flat tire, checking the angle of the jack before touching anything. The same careful habit he'd used with every piece of equipment he'd handled across 20 years in operations. Renata studied him for a moment, taking in the suit, the tie, the way he moved like someone who had somewhere important to be. She asked if he was headed to work. He told her he had an important appointment. She told him, quite firmly, that he should go, that she could manage on her own, that she didn't need him ruining his morning for a stranger on the side of the road. Marcus looked at the unstable jack, the slick pavement, the rain only getting heavier, and stayed anyway. There was nothing dramatic about it. No speech, no performance, just a man who knew how to change a tire and didn't feel right leaving someone to struggle through it alone in weather like that. Renata asked him why he'd risk being late for something that clearly mattered to him. Marcus answered simply that an interview could be explained, but a bad decision was much harder to undo. He never mentioned the company. She never asked what he did for a living, and in the strange, small privacy of that roadside encounter, neither learned much about the other beyond a first name and the way each of them handled pressure. It took roughly 12 minutes to finish the job, replacing the shredded tire, tightening the spare, lowering the jack, checking that everything was properly seated. When it was done, Renata wanted his number so she could thank him properly later, maybe send something, maybe repay the favor somehow. Marcus waved it off, told her she didn't owe him anything, and got back in his car before the conversation could go any further. The moment he checked the time, his expression changed. He called the recruiting line at Meridian, explained as calmly as he could that he'd run into an unexpected situation on the road and was on his way, and asked them to hold his slot a few more minutes. No one answered. He left a voicemail instead, his voice steady despite the tightness building in his chest, and pulled back into traffic with his knuckles pale on the wheel. Marcus reached the Meridian building 11 minutes past his scheduled time. He crossed the lobby at a near run, shoes squeaking against the polished floor, with no idea that the woman he'd just helped on the roadside was heading toward the very same building only minutes behind him. At the front desk, the receptionist glanced at the clock, then her screen, noting that his appointment window had technically closed. Marcus explained calmly what had happened and mentioned he'd called ahead, but before the receptionist could respond, Delphine Cross happened to be crossing the lobby with her assistant close behind. She recognized immediately that Marcus was the final candidate scheduled that morning, and rather than asking what had delayed him, she checked her watch and spoke before he'd finished a full sentence. "A candidate for a director role who can't manage his own schedule," she said, glancing at her assistant as though the remark were meant for an audience rather than for Marcus himself. Marcus apologized without spilling every detail of the morning, choosing brevity over explanation. Delphine told him plainly that at this level of the company, they didn't hire explanations. She flipped through the folder her assistant handed her, scanning his resume, and paused on the gap in his employment history along with a note from Human Resources referencing a prior request for flexible scheduling tied to family responsibilities. She asked, almost too casually, whether he was still a single father. Marcus confirmed it without elaborating. Delphine offered a thin, controlled smile and said that must make his schedule complicated already, which made this particular morning all the more concerning. It was a small remark, delivered lightly, but it did exactly what it was designed to do. It turned the fact that Marcus was raising a child alone into evidence against his competence, folding his personal life into a mark against his professional judgment before he'd even sat down. Delphine mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the candidate before him had arrived 25 minutes early. She called it executive discipline, the kind of quality Meridian expected from someone being considered for a director role. Marcus didn't raise his voice or argue the point. He simply asked for 10 minutes in the room and told her he'd let his work speak for itself. Delphine looked ready to cancel the interview outright, but Desmond Farr, the chief financial officer standing nearby, pointed out that Marcus had made the effort to show up and that the process deserved to run its course. Delphine agreed, reluctantly, and gestured toward the conference room down the hall. Marcus walked into that room already feeling like a verdict had been reached before a single question was asked. He took the seat offered to him, set his folder down with deliberate care, and reminded himself of something his old operations director used to say during the worst weeks of a supply chain crisis, back when half the warehouse floor seemed to be on fire at once: control what you can control. He couldn't control the traffic, the rain, the stranded car, or the impression already forming in Delphine's mind before he'd said a word about his qualifications. What he could control was how he answered the next hour of questions, and he decided, quietly, to let his answers do whatever convincing needed doing. It wasn't quite confidence, it was closer to the particular calm that comes from having very little left to lose and choosing to spend what remained on doing the work well instead of proving a point. The interview that followed seemed built, whether by design or not, to make Marcus fail. Delphine kept steering the conversation to favor the other finalist, a younger candidate named Preston Kane, whose polished resume and family connections had clearly opened doors that Marcus's hadn't. Preston had been asked about growth strategy, leadership philosophy, and his vision for the company 5 years out, questions built to showcase confidence and vocabulary rather than substance. When it was Marcus's turn, the questions shifted in a very different direction. Delphine asked whether he could work late nights on short notice. She asked who would take priority if his son needed him during a critical deadline. She asked whether the gap in his employment history had dulled his instincts, and more than once, why Meridian should choose someone who seemed to be trying to re-enter the workforce rather than someone already at the top of his game. At one point she asked directly whether a single father could realistically be flexible enough for a leadership role at this level. Marcus answered without hesitation that someone who had learned to manage real responsibility was usually more flexible, not less, because he'd already spent years solving problems that couldn't wait for a convenient moment. Delphine didn't seem satisfied and moved on quickly, as if the answer hadn't registered the way she wanted it to. There was a particular kind of person Delphine had spent her whole career surrounded by, the kind who arrived at every meeting with an assistant carrying their bags, whose family names opened doors before a single accomplishment made it onto a resume, who never had to explain a gap in employment because their families never let a gap exist in the first place. Delphine herself had followed that exact path, moving from a well-known university straight into a family friends firm, then into Meridian through a recommendation rather than a competitive search. She'd built her entire understanding of leadership around presentation, credentials, and the ease that comes from never having to fight for an opportunity, and she genuinely believed that ease was itself a kind of qualification. A man like Marcus, whose resume bore the marks of real struggle rather than a smooth, uninterrupted climb, didn't fit the picture she'd spent 20 years building of what an executive was supposed to look like. It wasn't entirely personal, though it certainly felt personal to Marcus sitting across from her. It was a worldview so deeply settled she rarely noticed herself applying it. It was Desmond who eventually steered the conversation toward something concrete, presenting a case study about one of Meridian's regional distribution centers struggling with delayed shipments, rising overtime costs, and a major client threatening to walk away from a long-standing contract. Preston had already proposed hiring additional staff and investing in new software, a solution that sounded impressive but would take months and a hefty budget to implement. Marcus studied the numbers Desmond handed him and noticed something different almost immediately. The real problem wasn't a shortage of people, it was a conflict in the truck scheduling and a shift handoff process that left workers idle during slow windows and overwhelmed during peak ones. He pointed out 3 specific time blocks where the bottlenecks occurred, noted that staffing during the slower windows was actually excessive, and calculated that the approval process for outbound shipments was adding an average delay of 47 minutes per load. Desmond leaned forward, visibly interested for the first time that morning. Delphine cut in immediately, insisting Meridian didn't need a supervisor's fix for a director's role. Marcus answered calmly that a director should never be so removed from operations that he couldn't see where the company was losing money in plain sight. He walked Desmond through the reasoning step by step, sketching a rough diagram on the back of the case study printout, showing how the shift handoff created a 15-minute dead zone twice a day where drivers waited on paperwork that could easily be processed in advance. He explained that the software Preston had proposed might eventually help somewhere down the line, but it would take months to implement and wouldn't fix the underlying scheduling conflict on its own, since the conflict lived in a set of habits and approval chains rather than a shortage of digital tools. Desmond asked a handful of sharper follow-up questions, testing whether the idea would hold up, and Marcus answered each one without hesitation, drawing on years of watching similar problems play out on warehouse floors he'd personally managed. Delphine watched with her arms folded, her earlier confidence visibly cooling as the conversation shifted from polish to substance. When Desmond asked how much budget his approach would need, Marcus told him the first 30 days would need almost nothing beyond a schedule redesign and closer tracking of the handoff windows. For a moment Delphine seemed to lose her footing, and she pivoted back to the one thing she still had leverage over. With a pointed edge in her voice, she asked whether they were really supposed to trust someone who couldn't manage to arrive on time. Marcus paused, weighing whether to explain the whole story of the morning, the rain, the stranded car, the woman who'd told him twice he didn't need to stay. Before he could decide, the conference room door opened. Renata Voss walked in, her hair dry now, her rain-soaked coat replaced by a tailored blazer, carrying herself with an entirely different presence than the woman Marcus had knelt beside on the roadside less than an hour earlier. Everyone in the room rose almost reflexively. Delphine's expression flickered with surprise as she said they hadn't expected her to join this particular round. Marcus looked at the woman in the doorway, then at the empty chair at the head of the table, and understanding settled over him slowly, like a piece finally locking into place. Delphine made the introduction in a voice that had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Marcus Reyes," she said, "this is Renata Voss, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Logistics Group." Renata looked directly at Marcus and said simply that they'd already met. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical. Delphine's composure cracked for a moment before she tried to recover, suggesting that if the two of them had already crossed paths, perhaps that explained his tardiness after all. Renata turned toward her and pointed out, evenly, that only minutes earlier Delphine had insisted his lateness didn't matter at all. It was the first real reversal of the morning, and it landed hard. Renata crossed the room and took the seat at the head of the table, setting down a slim folder of her own, and for a moment nobody spoke. Marcus searched her face for some sign of the woman he'd knelt beside in the rain, and found her there, though carried now with an entirely different kind of authority, the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned to command a room without raising her voice. She didn't smile at him in a way that suggested favoritism, and she didn't avoid his eyes either. She simply looked at him the way she might look at any candidate she was meeting for the first time in a professional setting, which was, in its own way, more respectful than anything Delphine had offered him all morning. But Renata didn't walk in and hand Marcus the job out of gratitude, and that restraint mattered more than anything else in the moment. She made clear, in front of everyone, that she had no idea how Marcus performed professionally. She only knew why he'd been late that morning, and because of that, she wanted the rest of the interview judged fairly, on its own merits, without bias working against him or sympathy working in his favor. It kept his position honest. He wasn't being carried by the CEO's goodwill. He was simply being given the chance to be judged on equal footing for the first time all morning. Still shaken, Delphine shifted her approach. She acknowledged that kindness was admirable but reminded the room they were selecting someone to manage hundreds of millions of dollars in operations, not handing out an award for good character. Renata's response was brief. She told Delphine to continue the interview. Delphine pressed forward with a harder scenario, clearly hoping to expose a weakness that would settle the matter for good. But Marcus handled the new challenge with the same steady clarity he'd shown with the distribution case, walking through his logic out loud so everyone could follow. It turned out that the exact bottleneck he'd identified minutes earlier was a problem the executive team had been quietly debating for nearly 3 weeks without resolution. Renata recognized the pattern the moment he laid it out, and something in her posture shifted. The polite formality of a stranger giving way to genuine, focused attention. She asked how long it had taken him to spot it. Marcus told her honestly it had taken about 7 minutes, working only from the numbers Desmond had handed him cold. Desmond didn't bother hiding his surprise. Delphine, for her part, began to understand that the man she'd spent the last half hour trying to dismiss was no longer someone she could simply wave away. She'd built her career on reading a room quickly, and what she read now was unwelcome. Preston's presentation, still fresh from the earlier session, had been smooth and well rehearsed, full of the language boards like to hear, but it hadn't produced a single new insight the executive team didn't already have. Marcus, arriving late, soaked from the rain, without a slide deck or a rehearsed opening line, had found in 7 minutes something a highly paid strategy team had circled around for weeks without resolving. Delphine could feel the balance of the room tilting away from the version of events she'd spent the morning constructing, and she didn't yet know how to pull it back. The interview didn't end with a triumphant hire, because that would have made everything too easy, and nothing about Meridian's culture worked that simply. Renata had to leave for a board meeting shortly after the case study discussion ended, and once she was gone, Delphine asked Marcus to stay behind for a moment in the hallway. She kept her voice low, almost pleasant, in a way that made the words underneath sting more sharply. She told him not to misread what had just happened in that room. Helping the chief executive change attire didn't make him an executive himself. Marcus told her he'd never assumed it did. Delphine continued anyway, explaining that people on this floor had spent 20 years building the relationships and reputations that put them there, and that no one simply walked in because they happened to meet the right person standing in the rain. It was a quiet, precise kind of cruelty, delivered without ever raising her voice, and it made clear exactly how Delphine viewed the world she'd built her career inside of. Marcus walked out of the building that afternoon replaying the exchange in his mind, not because it wounded him the way Delphine likely intended, but because it clarified something he'd already half suspected about how Meridian worked beneath its polished exterior. There was a version of the company that ran on results. The version Renata seemed to believe in, and another that ran on inherited comfort, the version Delphine had spent 2 decades protecting. He didn't know yet which version would decide his future, and there was nothing productive in guessing. He picked up his son that evening, listened to a long, meandering story about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, and didn't mention the interview at all. 2 days later, Marcus got an email saying Meridian had decided to move forward with another candidate. Preston Kane had gotten the position. Marcus was disappointed, but he didn't call Renata, didn't remind her of the favor, didn't try to use a rainy morning on the side of a road as leverage for a job he hadn't yet earned on his own terms. He sent a short, gracious note thanking the hiring committee for their time and closed the door on the matter, at least outwardly. That restraint, more than anything he'd said in the interview itself, was what eventually caught Renata's attention. Delphine believed she'd won cleanly. Behind the scenes, she'd quietly influenced the scoring that determined the outcome, lowering Marcus's leadership marks, inflating a category labeled availability risk, and treating his role as a single parent as legitimate grounds to question his long-term commitment to the position. Weeks later, while reviewing a routine hiring summary as part of an unrelated audit, Renata came across a line that stopped her cold. It read that the candidate showed limited executive availability due to single-parent obligations. She asked human resources who had written it. No one in the room seemed eager to answer. When she pulled the approval trail, the final signature belonged to Delphine Cross. Renata didn't act on impulse or overturn the decision on emotion alone, because a reversal built on sentiment wouldn't have held up against the very culture she was trying to fix. Instead, she created a real test grounded in the company's actual business. Meridian had a major client, Cascade Freight Company, threatening to pull a contract worth tens of millions of dollars over persistent delivery failures at one of the regional hubs. Renata asked both Preston and Marcus to prepare independent proposals and present them at a formal review with the client in the room. Delphine objected immediately, pointing out that Marcus had already been passed over for the position. Renata told her, evenly, that in that case she had nothing to worry about. Marcus was surprised to be contacted again and asked directly whether this had anything to do with the morning on the roadside. Renata told him plainly it did not. She was calling him back because the 7-minute analysis he'd produced cold, sitting in an interview under pressure, had outperformed a report the company had paid consultants 6 weeks to deliver. Marcus agreed to take part. Preston arrived with a polished slide deck, dense with consulting terminology, proposing a significant investment in new software and a 6-month implementation timeline promising sweeping improvements somewhere down the road. Marcus brought something far simpler. A hand-drawn flow of the shipment process, 3 concrete adjustments to the existing schedule, a basic dashboard to track results in real time, a 21-day trial window, and a clear plan for reversing course if the changes didn't work. The representative from Cascade Freight leaned toward Marcus's proposal almost immediately, because it offered something they could verify within weeks rather than something they had to take on faith for half a year. Delphine made one more attempt to tilt the room, remarking that Marcus clearly had a strong operational mind, but that this particular role required what she called executive presence. The Cascade representative asked, with little patience left in his voice, whether executive presence would get his containers out of the warehouse on schedule. The silence that followed said everything the room needed to hear. For the first time since Marcus had walked into that building weeks earlier, the balance of power in the conversation had shifted for good. Renata authorized a trial of Marcus's plan at the struggling distribution site, bringing him on as a consultant for 30 days before any decision about the permanent role would be made. Delphine remained convinced the plan would collapse under real-world pressure. Over the following 3 weeks, wait times at the facility dropped sharply. Overtime costs fell in line with the projections Marcus had outlined, and on-time delivery rates climbed high enough that Cascade Freight quietly withdrew its threat to cancel the contract altogether. There was nothing exaggerated about the results. The numbers were simply strong enough to prove Marcus had been right from the very first minute he looked at the data. When the results were presented to the executive committee, Delphine described the improvements as a cross-functional initiative from her own division, barely mentioning Marcus's name at all. Marcus sat near the back of the room and said nothing, unwilling to fight for credit in front of people he barely knew. Renata, reviewing the presentation, asked a simple question: who had actually designed the new scheduling model? Delphine hesitated, offering a vague answer about a collaborative effort across several teams. Desmond quietly opened the original proposal document on his laptop and turned the screen so the room could see the name at the top. It read Marcus Reyes. Renata asked the question again, more directly this time, and Delphine had no room left to maneuver. She admitted, in front of the entire committee, that the plan had come from Marcus. Renata turned toward him and said that the person who built the plan should be the one presenting its results. Marcus rose from his seat, and for the first time, Delphine was forced to sit and listen while the man she'd once dismissed as someone who didn't belong on this floor walked the executive committee through exactly how he'd fixed a problem that had cost the company money for months. The final turn in the story wasn't only about Marcus earning the position. It was about what happened when Delphine's own methods were turned back on her. Desmond, along with Human Resources, launched a closer review of the recent hiring process after the incident with the scoring summary came to light. What they found wasn't a single dramatic act of malice, but a pattern that was arguably worse for how quietly it had operated. Preston, it turned out, had prior business ties to the Cross family that had never been properly disclosed. Marcus's interview scores had been adjusted downward after the fact without documented justification. His responsibilities as a parent had been used as a factor in an evaluation category where it had no legitimate place. And once investigators looked further back, they found at least 2 other candidates over the previous year had been screened out using similarly vague, subjective criteria tracing back to the same office. Desmond, who'd watched the entire arc unfold from his seat on the finance side of the table, later admitted to Renata that he'd noticed something off during the original interview but hadn't trusted his own instinct enough to say anything at the time. He'd assumed, the way people often do inside large organizations, that someone with more seniority and more history at the company must have had a reason for the decision she made, even when those decisions felt uncomfortable to witness. It was a small confession, but it mattered, because it showed how easily an entire system could tilt around one person's quiet, persistent bias, simply because everyone around her assumed someone else would eventually push back. Delphine defended herself by insisting she'd simply been protecting the company's executive standards. Renata asked her, in front of the same committee that had once listened to her dismiss Marcus without hesitation, whether those were the company's standards or her own. Delphine didn't answer. Renata placed the 2 files side by side on the table, Preston's polished credentials on one side, Marcus's verified results on the other, and said that one man looked right on paper while the other had made the system actually work. In the weeks that followed, Delphine was stripped of her authority over executive hiring, placed under a formal governance review, and eventually chose to step down entirely once it became clear the board no longer had confidence in her judgment. There was no shouting in that final meeting, no dramatic confrontation, only the particular kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone finally understands exactly what happened and why it mattered. Preston, for his part, wasn't stripped of every opportunity at Meridian, since the review found no evidence he'd orchestrated any part of the scoring manipulation. He kept a position within the strategy division, though a considerably smaller one than what he'd originally been offered, and to his credit, he approached Marcus directly a few weeks later to acknowledge, somewhat awkwardly, that the process hadn't been fair to either of them in different ways. Marcus appreciated the gesture more than he expected to, and the two men settled into a working relationship that was professional if never particularly close, built on the kind of mutual respect that comes from surviving the same flawed system and landing on opposite sides of it. Renata eventually called Marcus into her office, a scene that mirrored almost exactly the moment weeks earlier when he'd walked into Meridian believing his opportunity had already slipped away. This time, it was the chief executive who'd been waiting for him. She offered him the position of Director of Strategic Operations, and she was careful to explain precisely why. It wasn't because of the tire he'd changed in the rain. It wasn't because he was raising a child on his own. It was because he'd noticed problems other people had walked past for months. Because he'd never once tried to trade on his relationship with her for an advantage. Because he'd stayed composed while being underestimated in a room full of people who should have known better. And because the results of his work, tested under real pressure, had spoken for themselves without needing anyone's help. Marcus took a moment before answering, not out of hesitation about the offer itself, but because he wanted to say something true rather than something that simply sounded grateful. He told Renata he'd spent 4 months walking into rooms where his employment gap and his responsibilities at home were treated as liabilities before anyone bothered to ask what he could actually do, and that this was the first time in a long while the work itself had been allowed to speak first. Renata told him that was exactly the kind of company she was trying to build. One where results weren't filtered through who a person's family knew or how smoothly they could deliver a rehearsed answer, and that his interview, chaotic as it had been, ended up testing exactly the qualities that mattered most. Marcus asked her one question before accepting. He wanted to know what would have happened if he'd never stopped that morning. Renata considered it a moment and told him he probably would have arrived on time. Then, after a pause, she added that she wasn't sure they'd have ever truly understood who he was. In the months that followed, Marcus settled into the rhythm of the new role, learning the wider architecture of the company beyond the single distribution site that had first proven his instincts right. He kept the same habits that had gotten him there. Arriving early whenever possible, listening more than he spoke in meetings he was still new to, and treating every problem on the floor as something worth understanding firsthand rather than managing entirely from a spreadsheet. His son, for his part, remained mostly unaware of how close the whole opportunity had come to slipping away, knowing only that his father seemed a little less tired in the evenings and a little more willing to laugh at the same worn jokes about baking soda volcanoes. Weeks later, Marcus walked through the Meridian lobby on an ordinary morning. A young job candidate rushed through the doors, visibly flustered, apologizing to the front desk for arriving late. The receptionist began preparing to turn him away. Marcus stopped, asked the young man if he'd call ahead to explain the delay, and when the answer came back yes, Marcus simply said they should hear him out before deciding who he was. He didn't mention Renata. He didn't deliver a long speech about second chances, he simply walked on, having quietly changed, in his own small way, the very culture that had once looked at him with contempt. Marcus Reyes arrived late to the most important interview of his life. But sometimes what reveals whether a person deserves a seat at the table isn't whether they walk into the room on time. It's whether they're willing to stop for someone else when no one is watching at all.